The carriage wheel cracked on the last turn before the gates, and Alara Whitfield nearly dropped the basket of white roses onto the muddy road. She caught it against her chest, heart pounding, and looked up at the towering iron gates of Ashworth Hall. She was already late. The wedding flowers were meant to be arranged by 10, and the sun was already climbing high above the stone towers. She pushed the broken wheel aside with her foot, and carried the basket the rest of the way herself, her arms aching, her breath short. The gatekeeper barely looked at her. Servants rarely did. She was the florist's daughter, a girl who arrived through the back gate with baskets of blooms and left before anyone learned her name. Inside the grounds, the hall rose like a mountain of gray stone, its windows catching the morning light. Alara had delivered flowers to great houses before, but never one so vast, so cold in its beauty. She hurried along the gravel path toward the servants' entrance, her mind racing through the arrangement she still had to finish. White roses for the altar, ivy for the pillars, lilies for the bride's chamber. She was 3 steps from the side door when she heard voices through an open window above her, sharp and low, carried on the still morning air. "You will not do this to me," a man said. His voice was deep, controlled, but shaking with something close to anger. "I did not ask for this marriage. I did not choose her. You have no choice left, Julian." The second voice belonged to a woman, older, commanding. "The papers are signed. The guests are already on the road. If you refuse now, you ruin more than yourself." Alara froze beneath the window, the basket trembling in her hands. She knew she should move. She knew servants who listened to their betters were servants who lost their positions. But something in the man's voice held her still, some rawness that did not belong to a duke on his wedding day. "I know what she is," he said. "I know what her family wants. Land, title, my name attached to their schemes. And you would still have me stand before God and swear myself to her?" "I would have you alive," the woman answered, quieter now. "There are things moving in this house that you do not see, Julian. Edmund Grey does not love Priscilla. He uses her like a key, and you are the door he wishes to open. If you refuse this marriage today, in front of all these witnesses, you hand him exactly the excuse he needs." Silence followed. Alara pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her pulse loud in her own ears. She understood now why the servants in the kitchen had been whispering all week, glancing toward the upper floors and falling silent whenever a stranger passed. She understood why the housekeeper had looked at her with something like pity when she handed over the flower order. A door slammed somewhere above. Footsteps crossed the floor and faded into another room. Alara let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, and turned to hurry away, desperate now only to deliver the flowers and disappear before anyone noticed she had heard a single word. She did not get the chance. "You there, girl with the roses." The voice came from behind her, cool and precise, the voice that had spoken through the window only moments before. Alara turned slowly and found herself facing a tall woman in dark violet silk, silver hair pinned high, eyes the pale gray of a winter sky. The Dowager Duchess Constance Ashworth. Alara had never stood so close to a woman of such rank, and for a moment she could not find her voice at all. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Alara dropped into a hurried curtsy, the basket of roses tilting dangerously in her arms. "I was only bringing the flowers for the chamber. I did not mean to listen. I will go at once." "Stay where you are." The command came so sharply that Alara's feet obeyed before her mind could argue. The dowager studied her for a long moment, her gray eyes moving over Alara's plain brown dress, her wind-blown hair, the calluses on her hands from years of cutting stems and thorns. There was something calculating in that gaze, something that made Alara feel as though she were being measured for a purpose she could not yet guess. "What is your name, girl?" "Alara, Your Grace. Alara Whitfield. My mother keeps the flower shop on Millbank Lane." "Whitfield." The dowager repeated the name softly, as though testing its weight. "And how old are you, Alara Whitfield?" 21, Your Grace." Alara's voice wavered. "Please, I have flowers still to arrange before the ceremony. If I am late, my mother's shop will lose the commission, and we cannot." "You heard what was said through that window." It was not a question. Alara's mouth went dry. She thought of denying it, of insisting she had heard nothing at all, but something in the dowager's face told her that lying now would be far more dangerous than admitting the truth. "I heard some of it, Your Grace. I did not understand all of what was meant. I swear I will speak of it to no one." "That," the dowager said, "is precisely the problem. A servant who has heard too much cannot simply be trusted to forget it. She must be given a reason to stay silent, or better still, a reason to help." Alara's stomach turned cold. She had heard stories, the kind housemaids whispered over washing basins, of great families who dealt harshly with servants who knew too much, positions lost, families ruined, worse things, in darker tales that were never quite proven true. She took a small step back, clutching the basket like a shield. "I want no trouble, Your Grace. I only deliver flowers." "And today," the dowager said, stepping closer, lowering her voice until it was barely above a whisper, "you will deliver something far more valuable than flowers, if you are wise enough to listen." Elara said nothing. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain the dowager could hear it. "My son is to be married within the hour," Constance continued, "to a woman who does not love him, arranged by a man who wishes only to bleed this family dry through her. I have spent 3 months trying to stop this wedding through proper means, and I have failed at every turn. The contracts are too tightly bound, the family's too eager. But there is one thing I have learned in 60 years of watching men like Edmund Grey work their schemes. They rely on speed, they rely on no one looking closely until it is far too late. I do not understand what this has to do with me, Your Grace." The dowager's grey eyes fixed on her, unblinking. "Lady Priscilla Vane has not yet arrived at the hall. Her carriage was delayed on the North Road this morning, quite by accident, of course." A faint, dangerous smile touched the corner of her mouth. "It may be delayed for some hours yet, long enough perhaps for a ceremony to take place before anyone realizes the bride herself is missing." Elara stared at her, uncomprehending, and then understanding arrived like cold water down her spine. "You cannot mean—" "I mean precisely what you think I mean." The dowager's voice did not waver. "You will stand before the altar in Lady Priscilla's place. You will wear her veil. You will speak the vows in her stead. No one beyond this house will see your face clearly enough to know the difference, not until it is far too late to undo what has been done. Your Grace, I am no lady. I am a florist's daughter. I could never—" "You could, and you will, because you have no other choice left to you." The dowager's tone hardened, though her eyes betrayed something almost like desperation beneath the command. "Your mother's shop sits on land leased through the Vane family, does it not? I made certain to learn a great deal about you the moment you walked through my gates this morning, girl. One word from me, and that lease is withdrawn within the week. Your mother loses her shop, you lose your home, or you help me save my son from a marriage that will destroy him, and I ensure that lease is renewed for the next 20 years, signed and sealed in your mother's name alone." Elara's mind reeled. She wanted to run, to drop the basket of roses and flee through the gates and never look back at Ashworth Hall again. But she thought of her mother's tired hands, of the shop that had fed them both since her father died, of the threat now hanging over everything she loved. "Why me?" she whispered. "There must be 100 women in this house who could stand in for a bride." "Because you are a stranger to this family," the dowager said. "Because no one in that chapel has ever laid eyes on you, and no one will think to question a veiled bride they have never truly seen before. And because," she added, her voice softening just slightly, "you have kind eyes, Elara Whitfield. My son has had precious little kindness shown to him. Perhaps that will serve us better than you know." Somewhere behind the hall, a bell began to ring, calling the household to the chapel. Elara looked down at the basket of white roses trembling in her hands, flowers she had cut only that morning in her mother's garden, never once imagining they would end up pinned to her own veil instead of laid upon an altar. "I have not yet said yes," she managed. "No," the dowager agreed, already turning toward the side door, silk skirts sweeping across the stone. "But you have not said no either, and we have very little time left before that becomes the only answer that matters." Elara stood frozen in the courtyard, the bell still ringing above her, the basket of roses growing heavy in her arms, and felt the entire shape of her ordinary life beginning, quietly and terribly, to change. A young housemaid hurried past her toward the chapel, arms full of linens, and paused just long enough to glance at Elara with wide, frightened eyes, before rushing on without a word. Elara understood then that she was not the only one who had guessed something was deeply wrong within these walls. The whole household moved like people bracing for a storm they could feel but not yet see. She thought of turning back toward the gate, of leaving the basket on the ground and walking away from Ashworth Hall as fast as her feet would carry her. No one would blame a florist's girl for fleeing trouble that was never hers to begin with. But the image of her mother's shop rose in her mind, the small bright window filled with jars of cut flowers, the only steady thing left in their lives since her father had died 2 winters past. She could not risk losing it, not for pride, not for fear, not even for the strange danger now folding itself around her. The dowager reappeared at the side door, a folded bundle of ivory silk draped over one arm. and behind her stood a thin, sharp-eyed woman Alara recognized at once as a lady's maid. "There is no more time for doubt," Constance said. "Merritt will help you dress. You need only walk where you are led, speak when you are told, and keep your face lowered beneath the veil until the ceremony is finished. My son already knows what is required of him. He will not betray you, and you will not betray him. Do you understand?" Ilara's throat tightened. "And if I am discovered? Then you will say a florist's daughter was mistaken for a duchess, and no one will believe such a foolish tale was anything more than an accident of veils and bad light." The dowager's eyes glimmered, sharp as broken glass. "Trust me, girl. I have spent a lifetime making certain rooms full of powerful people see exactly what I wish them to see." Merritt stepped forward and gently took the basket of roses from Ilara's arms, replacing it with the folded silk, heavier than it looked, smelling faintly of lavender and something colder beneath, like the scent of old stone corridors. Ilara looked down at the gown in her hands and felt her own future narrowing to a single, impossible hour. She did not know yet what kind of man waited at that altar, whether he was cruel or kind, whether he had agreed to this plan willingly or been driven to it by desperation as sharp as her own. She only knew that the bell was still ringing, and that somewhere beyond the chapel doors, a wedding was about to begin with a bride no one in that room had ever truly met. Merritt's hands moved fast, lacing the ivory gown tight against Ilara's ribs, pinning her dark hair beneath a veil so thick it turned the whole world to soft gray shadow. Ilara stood still in the small dressing room, hardly breathing, watching a stranger take shape in the tall mirror before her. The girl in the glass wore silk and pearls. The girl in the glass looked nothing like the florist's daughter who had walked through the gates that morning with mud on her boots. "Chin up," Merritt said, not unkindly. "A bride who looks at the floor draws more eyes than one who looks ahead." "I am not a bride," Ilara whispered. Merritt's hands paused for only a moment. "Today you are whatever Her Grace needs you to be. That is the safest way to think of it, if you want to walk out of this house again." Ilara turned slowly before the mirror, watching the veil settle around her shoulders like a soft gray cloud. She thought of her mother, alone at the shop this morning, humming over the counter as she trimmed stems for the day's deliveries, with no idea at all that her daughter now stood dressed as a duchess in a house full of strangers and secrets. If her mother could see her now, she would not believe it. Ilara hardly believed it herself. "Will it hurt very much?" she asked quietly. "If I am discovered?" Merritt's hands stilled on the final pin holding the veil in place. She looked at Ilara's reflection in the glass rather than at Ilara herself, as though it were easier to speak that way. "I have served this family 11 years, she said. "I have seen the dowager win battles that would have broken lesser women. If she has chosen you for this, it is because she believes you can carry it through. That is not nothing, coming from her." "That is not quite an answer to my question." A small, tired smile crossed Merritt's face. "No, it is not, but it is the only comfort I have to offer you this morning, and I think you would rather have honesty than false comfort, judging by the look of you." Ilara managed a faint smile of her own, grateful despite everything for the small kindness. Before she could say more, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, heavy and measured, and Merritt straightened at once, smoothing the last fold of silk into place. The door opened before Ilara could answer, and the dowager entered with her son close behind her. Ilara turned, and for the first time she saw the man whose voice she had heard through the window that morning, the man she was about to marry in another woman's place. Julian Ashworth was taller than she expected, broad through the shoulders, dressed in dark formal wool that made him look carved from the same gray stone as his family's hall. His face was handsome in a stern, unsmiling way, his jaw set tight, his dark eyes moving over her with an expression she could not read. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was no cruelty in it either, only exhaustion, and something like resignation. "So you are the girl my mother has dragged into her scheme," he said. His voice was quieter now than it had been through the window, but no less controlled. "Ilara, is it?" "Yes, Your Grace. You may stop calling me that for the next hour, since apparently I am about to marry a woman who has never once addressed me by my given name." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "Julian will do." Ilara did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all. The dowager stepped between them, her sharp eyes moving from her son to the veiled girl beside him, satisfied with what she saw. "We have very little time," Constance said. "Priscilla's carriage will not remain stranded on the North Road forever. Lord Vane sent riders ahead an hour ago demanding to know why his daughter has not arrived, which means someone will soon think to send a second carriage in her place. We must have the vows spoken and the register signed before that happens." "And afterward?" Ilara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. What happens to me afterward, once the register is signed and the danger has passed? Do I simply vanish back to Millbank Lane and pretend none of this occurred? The Dowager and her son exchanged a brief, unreadable look. Afterward, Julian said slowly, is a question none of us has fully answered yet. A marriage, once made in the eyes of God and law, is not so easily unmade. My mother assures me there are ways to have it quietly annulled once the danger to this family has passed. I intend to trust her on that point, since I have little choice remaining. And if those ways fail, Elara pressed, some stubborn courage rising in her despite the fear coiled tight in her chest. I am agreeing to stand before witnesses and swear myself to a stranger. I deserve to understand what I am risking. Julian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his dark eyes, a flicker of surprise perhaps, that a florist's daughter dressed in borrowed silk would dare to speak so plainly to a duke. You are risking everything, he said finally. As am I. If this fails, if Edmund Grey or Lady Priscilla learn the truth before the register is properly signed, we are both ruined, though in very different ways. You would lose your good name, and likely your family's shop besides. I would lose far more than that, my title, my lands, possibly my life, if Edmund is as ruthless as my mother believes him to be. The bluntness of it startled her more than any comforting lie would have. She had expected empty reassurance. The kind great men offered servants to keep them compliant. Instead, he had given her the plain, ugly truth, and something in that honesty steadied her more than kindness could have. Then we had better not fail, Elara said. A ghost of something almost like respect crossed Julian's face before he turned away, his jaw tightening again as duty settled back over him like armor. The Dowager clapped her hands once, sharp and decisive. Good. Then we understand one another. Julian, go and greet the guests as though nothing at all is amiss. Elara, come with me. There are a few final matters we must arrange before you walk down that aisle. Julian left the room without another word, though at the doorway he paused and glanced back at Elara once more, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than necessary before he disappeared into the corridor beyond. The Dowager led Elara through a narrow servants' passage that ran behind the main hall, moving quickly despite her age, her violet skirts whispering against the stone floor. You handled him well, Constance said without looking back. Most people, faced with my son's manner, either crumble or grow foolishly bold. You did neither. I only told him the truth, Your Grace. Yes, that is precisely what I mean. The Dowager stopped before a small side door and turned to face Elara directly, her expression unusually solemn. I must tell you something more before this goes any further, something my son does not yet fully understand himself. Edmund Grey did not simply arrange this marriage for wealth alone. There are documents, old ones, concerning the original Ashworth land grant, that Edmund believes could strip my son of his title entirely, if certain conditions are not met before the year is out. Marrying Priscilla was meant to secure his claim to those lands through her bloodline, should Julian's own claim ever be challenged and found lacking. Elara frowned beneath her veil. Then this marriage was never truly about love at all, not even the appearance of it. Very little in this family has ever been about love, the Dowager said, and for the first time, something almost sad passed across her sharp features. I had hoped, when Julian was young, that he might have the chance I never did, to choose for himself, rather than have choices made for him. Instead, I find myself making yet another choice on his behalf, though I pray this one serves him better than the last. Before Elara could ask what she meant, a bell rang out again, louder this time, closer, calling the last guest toward the chapel. There is no more time, Constance said, her voice snapping back to its usual sharp command. Listen carefully now. You will walk beside me down the side passage to the chapel entrance. You will keep your eyes low and your steps slow and measured, as any nervous bride might. The vicar has been told only that the bride wishes to keep her veil lowered until the vows are spoken, out of modesty. He will ask no questions beyond that, as he owes this family a great many favors already. Julian will meet you at the altar. You need only repeat the words as they are given to you. And Lady Priscilla's family? Will none of them notice the height is wrong, the voice unfamiliar? Priscilla's own mother is confined to her bed with a fever this week and will not attend. Her father sits 3 rows back with poor eyesight and poorer patience, more concerned with the wine to follow than the woman beneath the veil. The rest of the guests are Ashworth family and friends, none of whom have ever laid eyes on Priscilla Vane closely enough to know her voice from any other young woman's. The Dowager's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. I have spent 3 weeks arranging every detail of this deception, Elara Whitfield. Trust that I have not left such an obvious flaw unattended. They reached the side passage leading toward the chapel, and Alara could hear, faintly through the old stone walls, the murmur of gathered guests, the soft notes of a string quartet beginning to play. Her hands trembled inside her long silk gloves, and she pressed them together to still the shaking. "Your Grace," she said quietly, before they stepped into the light, "why do you trust me with this? You have known me less than an hour." The dowager paused, her gray eyes studying Alara's face beneath the veil with an intensity that made Alara feel, for one strange moment, as though this sharp old woman could see straight through silk and shadow both. "Because I have watched a great many young women scheme their way into wealth they did not deserve," Constance said softly, "and I have watched just as many honest women crushed beneath the weight of families who never once considered their worth. You came here this morning wanting nothing more than to deliver flowers and return home to your mother. That kind of honesty is rare in a house like this one, and rarer still in a moment like this one. I am gambling everything on the hope that it will hold, even beneath a stranger's veil." Before Alara could find any answer to that, a servant appeared at the end of the passage, pale and breathless. "Your Grace," he said, bowing quickly toward the dowager, "a rider has just come through the gates, Lord Vane's second carriage, sent to find Lady Priscilla on the North Road. They say the bride has been found. She is on her way here now, and by the look of the messenger she is furious." The dowager's face went utterly still, all warmth vanishing from it in an instant, replaced by cold, calculating resolve. "Then we no longer have the luxury of caution." She turned to Alara, gripping her gloved hand tightly. "The moment we step through those doors, there is no turning back, not for either of us. Are you ready?" Somewhere beyond the chapel walls, the music shifted, calling the ceremony to begin, and Alara realized, with a strange, cold certainty settling low in her chest, that whatever answer she gave now would decide the whole shape of the rest of her life. They moved quickly now, the dowager's grip firm around Alara's gloved fingers, their footsteps echoing softly against ancient stone. As they reached the final turn before the chapel entrance, Alara caught sight of her own reflection in a tall, gilded mirror hanging along the passage wall, a pale, veiled figure gliding through shadow, unrecognizable even to herself. For one strange heartbeat she wondered whether the girl in the glass might simply keep walking forward into this borrowed life and never look back toward Millbank Lane at all. Then the doors ahead swung open, and warm golden light spilled into the passage, carrying with it the low hum of gathered voices and the sweet, heavy scent of white roses, the very flowers she herself had cut only that morning. She recognized her own careful arrangements lining the aisle, ivy wound around each pillar exactly as she had planned it, lilies gathered thick near the altar steps. It struck her as strangely fitting that she should walk down an aisle decorated entirely by her own hands, toward a man she had met only minutes before. The dowager released her hand at the threshold, stepping back to take her place among the front pews, leaving Alara alone at the entrance to the chapel. Every head turned toward her as the music swelled, 100 curious eyes fixed on the veiled bride gliding slowly down the aisle. Alara kept her gaze low exactly as instructed, her heart slamming against her ribs with every measured step, silk skirts whispering across polished stone. She could feel Julian's eyes on her long before she reached the altar, waiting there in his dark formal coat, his expression carefully arranged into something solemn and composed for the watching crowd. Only Alara, close enough now to see the faint tension along his jaw, could tell how tightly he held himself together, how carefully controlled every breath had become. As she reached his side, he offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the warmth of him through the fine wool sleeve, feeling too the slight tremor he could not quite hide, no matter how composed his face remained. The vicar began to speak, his voice rolling out over the hushed chapel, words of duty and devotion that neither Alara nor Julian had ever expected to exchange with one another. Somewhere at the back of the chapel, a door creaked faintly open, and for one terrible instant Alara feared it was Priscilla, arrived at last to unravel everything before a single vow could be spoken. She did not dare turn to look. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her hands steady in Julian's, and let the ceremony carry them both forward into whatever came next. "Yes," she had said, and now there was no turning back from the path that answer had set beneath her feet. The vicar's voice rolled steady through the chapel, but Alara heard almost none of the words. Her whole body strained toward the door at the back of the room, waiting for it to burst open, waiting for a furious voice to shatter the fragile ceremony before it could finish. No voice came. Whoever had entered had simply taken a seat among the last rows, and the murmur of the crowd settled again into respectful silence. Julian's hand tightened faintly around hers, a small, steady pressure that seemed to say, "Hold on, we are almost through this." She did not know if he meant to comfort her or himself, but she took what strength she could from it all the same. "Julian Ashworth," the vicar intoned, "do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live?" There was the smallest pause, so brief that only Alara standing close beside him could have noticed it at all. Then Julian's voice rang out clear and steady across the chapel. "I do." The words landed heavier than Alara expected, striking something deep in her chest she could not name. She had known, of course, that this was only a performance, a desperate scheme to outwit a scheming rival before the true bride could arrive. And yet hearing those two words spoken aloud, in a voice that did not waver, made the moment feel far more real than any of them had prepared for. "And do you, Alara?" The vicar stopped himself, glancing down at the paper in his hand, correcting the name he had been given only that morning. "Do you, Priscilla, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live?" Alara's throat closed for one terrible second. The false name struck her strangely, a reminder of exactly how much danger wrapped itself around this single moment. She felt Julian's fingers tighten once more around hers, a silent urging, and she found her voice at last, soft but clear beneath the heavy veil. "I do." A ripple of quiet satisfaction moved through the gathered guests, soft murmurs of approval, a few muffled sniffles from older relatives moved by sentiment they believed entirely genuine. Alara kept her eyes lowered, terrified that even a glance toward the crowd might somehow give her away, though logic told her no one here had ever studied Priscilla Vane's eyes closely enough to notice the difference. The vicar lifted a slim gold ring from the velvet cushion a young page held forward, and Julian took it carefully, sliding it onto Alara's gloved finger with hands that were not quite steady. His thumb brushed briefly against her wrist as he did, warm despite the cool morning air still lingering in the old stone chapel, and Alara felt that small touch settle somewhere strange and unfamiliar beneath her ribs. "By the power vested in me," the vicar declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The words hung in the air, and for one suspended heartbeat neither of them moved. This had not been part of the arrangement discussed in whispered urgency only minutes before. Alara felt her pulse hammering beneath her borrowed silk, uncertain whether to step back or hold still, uncertain what either choice might reveal to the watching crowd. Julian solved the problem for her. He lifted the edge of her veil just enough to press the lightest, briefest kiss against her lips, quick and formal enough to satisfy any watching eye. But Alara felt the warmth of it long after he had already stepped back and lowered the veil once more into place. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The chapel erupted into applause and cheerful voices, and beneath the noise, Alara heard her own heart pounding louder than any of it. They were led quickly toward a small side chamber to sign the parish register, the vicar hurrying them along with the practiced efficiency of a man well paid to ask no further questions. Alara's hand trembled as she took the pen, staring down at the blank line waiting for her signature. To sign as Priscilla Vane would be forgery, plain and undeniable, a crime that could see her transported, or worse if ever discovered. She hesitated, pen hovering above the paper, and glanced up to find Julian watching her with sudden understanding dawning across his tired face. "Wait," he said quietly to the vicar. "There has been a small confusion in the paperwork, given the haste of this morning. Might we have a private moment before the register is finalized?" The vicar, eager to please a duke on any matter, bowed and stepped outside the chamber, leaving them alone for the first time since the ceremony began. Julian turned to Alara at once, his composed mask slipping just slightly to reveal the strain beneath it. "You cannot sign her name," he said. "My mother did not think this far ahead, or perhaps she did and simply did not tell either of us. If you sign as Priscilla Vane, you commit a crime that could ruin you far more thoroughly than any scandal ever could." "Then what would you have me do?" Alara whispered, panic rising sharp in her chest. "The register must be signed, or none of this holds any legal weight at all. And your mother said the marriage must be binding before Priscilla arrives, or the entire plan falls apart." Julian was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes moving over her face, as though searching for an answer written somewhere in her features. Then something shifted in his expression, a decision forming behind his eyes. "Sign your own name," he said quietly. "Alara Whitfield, let the marriage be legally, truly binding, exactly as it appears to any court that might ever examine it. No forgery. No crime, only the plain truth, that the Duke of Ashworth married a woman named Alara Whitfield this morning, of his own free will." Alara stared at him, stunned. "But that changes everything. If I sign my true name, there is no simple annulment waiting for us once the danger passes. We are truly, legally married, in every sense that matters." "Yes," Julian said, and something steady settled into his voice, something that had not been there in his earlier reluctant agreement to his mother's scheme. "I understand that fully, but I would rather stand accused of an unusual marriage than have you stand accused of forgery, Alara. That price is not one I am willing to ask you to pay." Alara searched his face for any sign of trickery, any hint that this offer served some hidden purpose of his own, and found none, only quiet resolve, and something else beneath it she did not yet have a name for. "Your mother will be furious," she said softly. "My mother," Julian answered, the faintest trace of dry humor returning to his voice, "orchestrated a scheme this morning that involved deceiving an entire congregation and sabotaging a bride's carriage on the North Road. I believe she has forfeited any right to be furious about a technicality in the parish register." Despite everything, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, Alara felt a small, unexpected laugh escape her. Julian's mouth curved into the first true smile she had seen from him all morning, brief but genuine, transforming his stern features into something far warmer than she had expected to find beneath all that careful composure. She took up the pen again and signed her own name, clear and steady, Alara Whitfield, beneath the space where Julian had already signed his own. The ink dried slowly on the page, sealing a truth far stranger and more binding than either of them had walked into that chapel expecting. They emerged from the side chamber to find the vicar waiting with barely concealed impatience, and beyond him, through the chapel's open doors, the sound of raised voices carried in from the courtyard, sharp and furious, cutting clean through the pleasant chatter of departing wedding guests. "That is her," Julian said quietly, his jaw tightening once more. "Priscilla has arrived." They stepped out into the courtyard together, just as a young woman in a travel-stained gown came storming up the front steps, her face flushed with fury, her golden hair falling loose from its pins. Behind her strode a lean, sharp-featured man in an elegant coat, his expression carefully controlled despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. Edmund Gray, watching the scene unfold with calculating eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" Priscilla demanded, her voice carrying sharp across the courtyard, drawing the attention of every remaining guest. "I was told the ceremony has already concluded. That is impossible. I have not yet arrived to be married." A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the crowd. The dowager stepped forward smoothly, positioning herself between the furious young woman and the veiled figure still standing close beside Julian. "I am afraid there has been a rather significant misunderstanding, Lady Priscilla," Constance said, her voice calm and clear enough to carry across the entire courtyard. "When your carriage failed to arrive at the appointed hour, and no word came explaining the delay, we assumed the worst and proceeded according to a contingency my son and I had discussed only as a precaution, should some unfortunate accident prevent you from reaching the chapel in time." "A contingency," Priscilla repeated, her voice rising dangerously. "What contingency involves marrying my betrothed to some other woman entirely?" "The contingency," the dowager said smoothly, "in which my son married a woman his family had already approved of, rather than leave a duke standing unmarried and vulnerable at the altar, a position that would have invited a great deal of unwanted scandal and speculation regarding this family's stability. I am sure you understand, given your own family's careful attention to such matters." Edmund Gray's eyes narrowed, sharp and calculating, moving between Julian and the veiled woman at his side, with an intensity that made Alara's skin prickle beneath her veil. "And who," he said, his voice smooth and dangerously quiet, "is this fortunate bride exactly?" Julian stepped forward, his arm settling protectively around Alara's shoulders, his voice steady and final. "My wife," he said simply, "the Duchess of Ashworth. The marriage is legal, witnessed, and recorded in the parish register not 10 minutes past." "There is nothing left to discuss on this matter, Lord Gray, save perhaps an apology for the confusion this morning's delay has caused everyone involved." Priscilla's face went white, then red with fury, and for one dreadful moment Alara feared the young woman might tear the veil from her face right there in front of the entire courtyard. But Edmund's hand closed firmly around Priscilla's arm, a silent warning, and she subsided into furious, simmering silence instead, her eyes promising this was far from finished. "This is not over," Edmund said quietly, his gaze fixed on Julian with cold, deliberate menace. "You will find, Your Grace, that hasty decisions made in a moment of panic often carry consequences no one anticipated at the time." He turned Priscilla firmly away and led her back down the steps toward their waiting carriage, the crowd parting before them in uneasy silence. The dowager watched them go with narrowed eyes, her satisfaction at the successful ceremony tempered visibly by the weight of that final quiet threat. Beside Alara, Julian let out a long, slow breath, the tension finally easing from his shoulders now that the confrontation had passed without immediate disaster. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching her face beneath the veil, as though trying to read what she was thinking. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, only for her to hear. "I promise you this was never meant to cost you so dearly. I will find some way to make this right, Alara, whatever that requires of me." Alara said nothing, unable to find words steady enough to answer him, and together they turned to face the household staff already beginning to whisper and stare. The beginning of an entirely new life neither of them had chosen, now bound together by nothing more than a hasty scheme and a signature written in her own true name. The dowager guided them both quickly back inside, away from curious eyes still lingering in the courtyard, and led them into a private drawing room where a fire crackled low in the hearth despite the mild morning. She closed the heavy door behind them and turned, her composed mask slipping at last to reveal something closer to exhaustion. "That went considerably worse than I had hoped, and considerably better than I feared," she said, sinking into a high-backed chair near the fire. "Edmund Gray is not a man who accepts defeat quietly. We must assume he is already searching for some way to challenge the legality of this marriage, or failing that, some way to make both of your lives difficult enough that you regret it." "Let him try," Julian said, though the weariness in his voice undercut the boldness of his words. "The register is signed, the vicar witnessed it properly. There is no ground for him to challenge, whatever he may wish were otherwise." "There is always ground for a man like Edmund," the dowager said grimly. "He does not need the marriage overturned to cause you harm. He needs only to make enough noise, spread enough doubt, that society begins to whisper, and your standing suffers regardless of what the law says. We must be prepared for that, and prepared quickly." Alara stood near the door, still wrapped in her veil and borrowed silk, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a conversation about consequences that would shape the rest of her own life. She reached up with trembling fingers and finally lifted the heavy veil away from her face, letting it settle around her shoulders, and drew in her first full, unobstructed breath since the ceremony began. Julian turned at the small movement and studied her properly for the first time since the vows had been spoken, his dark eyes moving over her face with an expression she could not quite name. Whatever he saw there seemed to soften something in his stern features, if only slightly. "You did remarkably well today," he said quietly. "Better than I expected from a stranger thrown into a scheme not of her own making." "I had very little choice in the matter," Alara answered, though there was no real bitterness in her voice, only tired honesty. "Your mother made certain of that before I ever agreed to anything." The dowager, still seated near the fire, did not look remotely apologetic. "I did what was necessary to protect this family, and I would do it again without hesitation. But I will say this much in my own defense, Alara Whitfield. I chose you specifically because I believed you capable of carrying this through with grace, and you have proven that belief correct within a single morning. That is not a small thing." A knock sounded at the drawing room door, and a servant entered bearing a tray of tea and light refreshment, setting it carefully upon the low table before retreating just as quickly, clearly eager to escape the tension still thick in the room. Julian poured a cup and offered it to Alara without a word, a small, unexpected gesture of consideration that caught her off guard more than any grand declaration might have. "What happens now?" Alara asked, accepting the cup with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "I cannot simply return to Millbank Lane this afternoon as though nothing at all has changed. Word of this marriage will spread through the county within a day, and my mother will hear I am now a duchess before I ever have the chance to explain it to her myself." "You will remain here, at Ashworth Hall, for the time being," the dowager said, as though the matter required no further discussion. It would raise far more suspicion for the new duchess to vanish back to a flower shop the morning after her own wedding than for her to settle properly into her husband's household, as any bride would. "And my mother? I will send a carriage for her myself, this very afternoon, along with a full explanation and my personal assurance that her daughter is safe and well cared for," Constance said. "She may join you here, if she wishes, or remain at the shop with the lease secured exactly as I promised. That choice belongs entirely to her." Alara felt a small measure of relief loosen the tight knot of worry in her chest, though 100 new uncertainties rose immediately to take its place. She glanced toward Julian, who watched her over the rim of his own teacup with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet concern. "I suppose," she said slowly, "we ought to discuss what this marriage actually means, now that it is truly, legally binding." I do not know how a duke and his duchess are meant to conduct themselves, Julian. I have never lived in a house larger than 4 rooms. Nor have I ever been married before this morning, Julian said, the faint dry humor returning to his voice again. So perhaps we shall have to discover the particulars together as we go along. Despite the exhaustion and uncertainty still weighing heavy in the room, Ilara felt the corner of her mouth lift into something almost like a real smile. Whatever strange, tangled path had brought her to this drawing room, dressed in borrowed silk and bound by a signature written in her own true name, she found herself unwilling to regret it entirely. Not yet. Not when the man across from her met her uncertainty with such steady, unexpected patience. The dowager watched the small exchange between them with sharp, satisfied eyes, saying nothing, though the faintest hint of a smile touched her own composed features as she rose and moved quietly toward the door, leaving the newly married couple alone to begin, however awkwardly, the strange new life now stretched out before them both. A scream shattered the quiet of the east corridor before dawn had fully broken, and Ilara sat bolt upright in the unfamiliar bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. 3 days had passed since the wedding, 3 days of learning the strange rhythms of Ashworth Hall, and she had not yet grown used to the sounds of a house so large it seemed to breathe on its own in the darkness. But this sound was different. This was fear. She threw a robe over her nightgown and hurried into the corridor, following the commotion toward the west wing, where a cluster of servants had gathered outside the door of the estate's private study, their faces pale in the candlelight. Julian arrived only moments after her, his hair disheveled from sleep, pulling a coat over his shirt as he pushed through the small crowd. "What has happened?" he demanded. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Pratt, wrung her hands together nervously. "The study, Your Grace. Someone has been through it in the night. The desk drawers are all pulled open, papers scattered across the floor. Nothing appears taken, but someone has clearly been searching for something." Julian's jaw tightened and he pushed past the gathered servants into the study, Ilara following close behind him despite the housekeeper's faint protest. Inside, the room told its own story of urgency and haste. Drawers hung open at odd angles, their contents spilled across the polished floor, and the lock on a small iron strongbox in the corner had been forced open, its lid bent where someone had pried at it with considerable force. "Is anything missing?" "Where?" Ilara asked, kneeling to gather scattered papers back into some semblance of order. Julian moved to the strongbox and examined its contents with a frown deepening across his features. "Difficult to say. Precisely. This box holds old estate documents, land grants, records of the original Ashworth title going back 3 generations. Nothing of obvious monetary value, which makes the break-in stranger still. A common thief would have taken the silver from the dining hall or the jewelry from my mother's chambers, not paperwork from a locked study." Ilara went still, memory surfacing sharp and sudden. "Your mother mentioned something to me, before the wedding. She said Edmund Gray believed certain old documents concerning the original land grant might allow him to challenge your claim to the title, if the right conditions were met." Julian's head snapped up, his dark eyes meeting hers across the disordered room. "She told you that?" "She told me a great deal, in the little time we had before the ceremony." Ilara rose, brushing dust from her robe. "I did not think to mention it sooner. There has been so much else to occupy us these past few days. I confess it slipped entirely from my mind until just now." Julian crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt beside the strongbox again, sorting through its contents more carefully this time, comparing what remained against some mental record only he seemed to possess. His frown deepened with every passing moment. "The original charter is here," he said slowly. "But there was a secondary document, a letter of confirmation from the Crown, dated some 60 years past, that clarified certain ambiguous language in the original grant regarding inheritance through the female line, should the male line ever fail. That letter is missing. What would such a letter matter to Edmund Gray?" Julian sat back on his heels, his expression grim. "If that letter cannot be produced, and a challenge were ever raised against my claim to this title on some technical ground, the ambiguity in the original charter alone might be enough to cast doubt upon the entire inheritance. Enough doubt, perhaps, to drag the matter before the courts for years, tying up the estate's income and assets in litigation the whole while." "And who would benefit from such a prolonged dispute?" Ilara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer before Julian spoke it aloud. "Anyone with a legal claim waiting in the wings," he said quietly. "Anyone patient enough to let the courts drain this family's resources and reputation both, until a weakened, distracted duke becomes far easier prey than a confident one." They were interrupted by the dowager's arrival, moving briskly into the study despite the early hour. Her silver hair hastily pinned, her expression already sharp with understanding as she took in the ransacked room. "The confirmation letter," she said immediately, confirming Julian's worst fears without needing to be told. "That is what they were searching for." "You knew this letter existed," Julian said, an edge of frustration creeping into his voice. "Why did you never mention it to me before now?" "Because I hoped it would never need mentioning," Constance said, sinking into a nearby chair, suddenly looking every one of her 60 years. "That letter has sat safely in this house for 3 generations, Julian. I never imagined anyone outside this family even knew of its existence, let alone considered it valuable enough to risk breaking into a locked study to find." "Clearly someone knew," Alara said, "and clearly that someone believed the letter important enough to search for before finding whatever else they might have wanted." The Dowager's sharp eyes moved to Alara, considering. "Edmund Gray has connections throughout the county, including, I am ashamed to say, among the staff of several great houses, our own included at one time or another. It would not surprise me greatly to learn he purchased knowledge of this letter's existence from some disgruntled former servant years before this marriage scheme was ever conceived." Julian rose from his position beside the strongbox, pacing the length of the study with barely contained frustration. "Then we must assume Edmund now possesses knowledge of exactly what to search for, even if he did not find it here last night. If the letter has been moved, hidden elsewhere within this house, he will simply try again, more carefully next time." "Has it been moved?" Alara asked. Silence answered her question more completely than words could have. The Dowager and her son exchanged a long, troubled look, and Alara understood with sinking certainty that no one in the room could say with confidence exactly where that crucial letter now rested, or whether it had already fallen into hands far more dangerous than their own. That evening, Julian found Alara in the small library off the main hall, curled into a window seat with a book she had barely managed to read past the first page, her mind still turning over the missing letter, and all it might mean for the family she had so suddenly joined. He hesitated in the doorway, as though uncertain of his welcome, before stepping inside and taking the chair across from her. "My mother tells me you have hardly eaten today," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "She worries you find this house unwelcoming." "It is not the house," Alara said honestly. "It is everything the house seems to be hiding. I grew up in 4 small rooms above a flower shop, Julian. I understood every corner of my own home. Here I feel as though I am forever standing in a corridor that leads somewhere I cannot see." Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she was slowly learning to read, thoughtful rather than cold, careful rather than distant. "I have lived in this house my entire life," he said finally, "and some days I feel precisely the same way. There are wings of this estate I have not fully explored, secrets my own family kept even from me until they became unavoidable. I am sorry you have been drawn into the middle of it so suddenly, with so little warning." "I do not regret it," Alara said, surprising herself with how readily the words came. "I regret the danger certainly, and the uncertainty, but I do not regret standing beside your mother that morning, or signing my own name in that register." Something shifted in Julian's face, warm and unguarded for just a moment before old habits of caution smoothed it away again. "Nor do I," he said quietly. "Whatever comes of Edmund Gray's schemes, I find myself grateful, more than I expected to be, for the woman who agreed to stand beside me that day." The words settled between them, simple and honest, and Alara felt her cheeks warm despite herself. Neither of them spoke further of it that night, but something had shifted quietly in the space between them, a small thread of trust beginning to weave itself into something sturdier than either had anticipated when this strange arrangement first began. Word of the sudden marriage spread quickly through the county in the days that followed, exactly as the Dowager had predicted. Alara caught whispers whenever she ventured beyond the estate grounds, curious glances from shopkeepers and neighboring gentry alike, all of them eager to catch a glimpse of the mysterious florist's daughter, who had somehow become a duchess overnight. Some regarded her with open curiosity, others with poorly disguised scorn, certain that a woman of her humble birth had no true place among their ranks. Alara bore it all with quiet patience, though the weight of so many watching eyes left her exhausted by the end of each day. Her mother arrived at Ashworth Hall 3 days after the wedding, brought by the carriage the Dowager had promised, and the reunion brought Alara more comfort than she expected. Her mother wept and laughed in equal measure, marveling at the grandeur of the estate, while fretting endlessly over whether Alara was eating properly and sleeping enough. She chose, in the end, to remain at the shop on Millbank Lane rather than move permanently into the great house, though she promised to visit often, and the lease Constance had secured in her name alone brought a relief to her tired eyes that Alara had not seen in years. "You look different," her mother said quietly, before she departed again for home. "Not simply the fine clothes, my dear. Something in your face has changed." Ilara had no answer for that, beyond a small, uncertain smile, unwilling yet to examine too closely what her mother had so easily noticed. Over the following days, Ilara found herself drawn steadily deeper into the quiet unease that had settled over Ashworth Hall. She noticed things she might once have dismissed as ordinary household friction, small signs that something beneath the surface of the estate did not sit right. A footman who avoided her gaze whenever she passed through the east corridor, whispered conversations among the kitchen staff that fell abruptly silent the moment she entered the room, a locked door on the second floor that Mrs. Pratt claimed led only to unused storage, though the housekeeper's eyes had flickered away too quickly when Ilara asked about it. She mentioned none of these small observations to Julian at first, uncertain whether they meant anything at all or whether she was simply a stranger in an unfamiliar house, seeing shadows where none truly existed. But on the fourth night after the break-in, unable to sleep, she wandered the darkened corridors of the West Wing and found herself once more outside that same locked storage door, moonlight spilling faintly through a nearby window. She pressed her ear against the old wood, uncertain what she expected to hear, and caught the faint, unmistakable murmur of a voice inside, low and urgent, speaking words she could not quite make out through the heavy door. A second voice answered, sharper, more familiar somehow, though she could not place why the sound sent an uneasy chill crawling down her spine. Footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor, and Ilara stepped back quickly into the shadow of a nearby alcove, her heart pounding. A figure passed close by, cloaked and hooded despite the mild evening, moving with quick, purposeful steps toward the servant's stair at the corridor's end. Ilara caught only the briefest glimpse of a face beneath the hood before the figure vanished down the stairs, but it was enough to send cold recognition flooding through her. She had seen that face before, at the edge of the courtyard on her wedding day, standing close beside Edmund Gray. Trembling, Ilara made her way back to her own chamber, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. Someone within Ashworth Hall itself, someone trusted enough to move freely through its corridors at night, was working with Edmund Gray against the very family that employed them. The break-in had not been the work of an outside intruder slipping past locked gates and watchful guards. It had been an inside betrayal, carried out by someone who already possessed every key and every secret passage this ancient house contained. She did not sleep again that night, turning the discovery over and over in her mind, uncertain whether to bring her suspicions to Julian immediately, or to watch and wait a little longer, gathering more certain proof before accusing anyone within this household of such dangerous treachery. By the time morning light finally broke pale and gray across the estate grounds, Ilara had made her decision. She would find proof first, clear and undeniable, before she spoke a single word of what she had witnessed in the dark of that corridor. Whatever danger still moved unseen through Ashworth Hall, she intended to meet it with more than mere suspicion when the moment finally came. She thought of Julian's warm, unguarded words in the library, of the quiet trust that had begun to grow between them despite everything working against it. If someone within these walls truly meant to betray this family, meant to hand Edmund Gray whatever weapon he needed to tear apart the fragile life she and Julian had only just begun to build together, then Ilara intended to stand in the way of it with everything she had. She was no longer merely a florist's daughter caught in a scheme not of her own making. She was the Duchess of Ashworth now, bound by law and by something far harder to name, and she would not let a hooded figure moving through midnight corridors take that from her without a fight. Lying awake as dawn crept over the eastern hills, Ilara resolved to begin watching the household more carefully than ever before, cataloging every strange glance, every hushed conversation cut short, every servant whose loyalty she could no longer take entirely for granted. Somewhere within these ancient stone walls, an enemy moved freely among people who trusted them completely, and Ilara meant to uncover exactly who that enemy was before they could do any further harm. A gloved hand closed hard around Ilara's wrist in the darkness, yanking her back from the locked storage door before she could pull away, and a low voice hissed close against her ear. "You should not be here." Ilara spun, heart hammering, ready to scream, and found herself face to face not with some stranger, but with Merritt, the dowager's own lady's maid, her sharp eyes wide with alarm in the dim corridor light. Ilara pressed a hand to her chest, willing her racing pulse to slow. "You frightened me half to death," she whispered. "Better frightened than discovered," Merritt answered, glancing anxiously toward the far end of the corridor. "I have watched you circling this door for 3 nights now, Duchess. Whatever you suspect lies behind it. You must be far more careful than this, or you will draw attention from exactly the people you cannot afford to notice you." Alara's breath caught. You know something about this room. Merritt hesitated, torn between loyalty and something else Alara could not quite name, before finally nodding once, sharp and reluctant. Follow me, not here. Walls have ears in this house, and some of those ears belong to people who would report every word straight back to Lord Grey. She led Alara down a narrow servants' passage and into a small linen room, closing the door softly behind them and lighting a single candle that cast long shadows across shelves stacked high with folded sheets. Only then did she speak again, her voice barely above a whisper. I have served this family a long time, Merritt said. Long enough to know most of its secrets, and long enough to know which ones are dangerous to speak aloud. That storage room holds nothing of value itself. But the footman who let himself in there 3 nights past, the one you saw leaving hooded and cloaked, his name is Colm. He came to this household only 8 months ago, hired suddenly, without the usual references properly checked. I always thought it strange, given how careful Her Grace usually is about such matters. Do you believe he is working for Edmund Grey? I believe, Merritt said carefully, that Colm has been seen leaving the grounds late at night more than once these past weeks, always toward the village, always returning before dawn. I have said nothing of it before now because I had no proof beyond my own suspicion, and accusing a fellow servant without cause is no small matter in a house like this one. Alara's mind raced, piecing together everything she had witnessed and heard since the break-in. The missing letter, she said slowly. If Colm has been meeting someone in the village passing along information about this household, he may know exactly where the confirmation letter has been hidden, or he may be searching for it himself even now. Then we must discover which, and quickly, Merritt said. But Duchess, you cannot go chasing after proof alone in the dead of night. If Colm truly serves Edmund Grey, and he catches you searching where you should not be, I fear what a desperate man might do to protect such a valuable secret. Alara considered this, turning the problem over carefully. Then I will not search alone. I will bring Julian, and together we will watch Colm closely, until he leads us to whatever proof we need. But first, Merritt, I must ask you something important. Can you tell me where in this house the confirmation letter is currently kept? If Julian's mother trusted you with even a portion of the family's secrets, perhaps you know more than you realize. Merritt's expression grew troubled. Her Grace never told me directly. But I recall, some months past, seeing her carry a small bundle of papers into the old chapel crypt beneath the east wing, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. I thought little of it at the time. Now I wonder if that was not the very letter you seek. Alara's pulse quickened with new purpose. Thank you, Merritt. Truly. I will not forget this kindness. She found Julian in his study an hour later, still awake over a stack of estate correspondence, and relayed everything Merritt had told her in a low, urgent voice. Julian listened with growing intensity, his exhaustion falling away as the pieces began fitting together in his mind. The old chapel crypt, he said. My mother mentioned it once years ago, as a place where certain family documents had traditionally been kept safe, hidden behind a section of loose stone few people beyond the family itself ever knew existed. If Colm has been searching this house without success, it is because he has been searching the wrong places entirely. Then we must move the letter before he thinks to search there, Alara said. Or better still, we set a trap. Let him find it and catch him in the act of stealing it, with proof enough that even Edmund Grey cannot argue his way free of the accusation. Julian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration warming his tired features. You have a talent for scheming I did not expect from a florist's daughter, Alara. I have spent my whole life watching customers try to cheat my mother out of a fair price, Alara said, a faint smile touching her mouth despite the tension of the moment. One learns to think several steps ahead, or one learns to go hungry. They brought the plan to the Dowager the following morning, and though Constance's sharp eyes flickered with surprise at the boldness of the scheme, she agreed readily enough, adding her own careful refinements to ensure nothing was left to chance. That evening, under cover of preparing the crypt for a supposed ancestral remembrance ceremony, Julian moved the true letter to a locked strongbox within his own chambers, replacing it in the crypt's hidden alcove with a folded, worthless page of old estate accounts, wrapped in identical oilcloth to appear untouched. Then they waited. 3 nights passed with no movement from the shadowed corridors, and Alara began to fear their trap had somehow been discovered before it could ever be sprung. On the 4th night, long after the household had settled into silence, a soft creak sounded from the servant's stair beyond Alara's chamber door, exactly as Merritt had described hearing before. Alara slipped from her bed, already dressed and waiting for exactly this moment, and moved quietly to wake Julian in the adjoining chamber. Together they crept through darkened corridors toward the east wing, following the faint flickering glow of a shielded candle moving steadily toward the old chapel entrance. They reached the crypt just as the hooded figure knelt before the hidden alcove, prying loose the section of stone Merritt had described, reaching inside to withdraw the folded oilcloth bundle with hands that trembled with obvious urgency. Julian stepped forward from the shadows, his voice cutting sharp through the silent crypt. "I would think carefully before taking another step, Colm." The figure froze, then spun around, candle flickering wildly, and beneath the fallen hood, Alara saw the pale, frightened face of a young footman she recognized vaguely from the household staff, barely older than herself. "Your Grace," Colm stammered, the bundle still clutched in his shaking hands. "I can explain." "Then explain quickly," Julian said, his voice cold and controlled, "and explain honestly, because I already know a great deal more than you might hope." Colm's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of that steady gaze. He sank against the crypt wall, the bundle slipping from his fingers to the stone floor. "Lord Grey," he whispered. "He found me in the village, months ago, before I ever came to work in this house. He offered payment for information, small things at first, household schedules, who traveled where and when. I never meant for it to go so far, Your Grace, I swear it, but once I had taken his coin, he made clear there was no simple way to stop." "And the confirmation letter?" Alara pressed gently, stepping forward beside Julian. "What did Edmund Grey promise you for finding that?" "Enough money to leave this county entirely," Colm admitted, shame coloring his voice. "Enough to start somewhere new, somewhere no one would ever know what I had done here. I searched the study first, then every room I could reach without drawing suspicion, until finally, a stray comment from one of the older servants led me toward the crypt." Julian knelt and retrieved the fallen bundle. Unwrapping it just enough to confirm the worthless pages of old estate accounts still lay folded within, untouched by whatever true document Colm had hoped to find. "You very nearly succeeded tonight," he said quietly. "Had we not moved the true letter days ago, you would have delivered exactly what Edmund Grey needed to challenge this family's entire claim to its title." Colm's face went ashen with the realization of how close he had come, and how thoroughly he had been caught in the end. "What will become of me now, Your Grace?" Julian was silent for a long moment, weighing something carefully behind his dark eyes. "That depends entirely on what you are willing to offer me now, in exchange for whatever mercy I might still be persuaded to extend. Edmund Grey has used you as a tool, Colm, the same way he has used a great many people in service of his own ambitions. I have little interest in destroying a desperate young man's life when the true architect of this scheme still walks free, believing himself untouchable." Colm looked up, hope flickering uncertain across his frightened features. "You would truly consider mercy after everything I have done?" "I would consider a full, honest account of everything Edmund Grey has asked of you these past months," Julian said. "Written and signed, with your own hand, detailing every payment, every task, every piece of information you have passed along to him. Give me that, freely and completely, and I will see you safely away from this county, with enough coin to start honestly, wherever you choose to go, rather than see you punished for a scheme far larger than yourself." Colm did not hesitate long before nodding, relief and gratitude flooding his young face in equal measure. "I will tell you everything, Your Grace. Every last detail I can remember." Within the hour, seated in Julian's study with candles burning low, Colm dictated a full confession, while Alara transcribed his words carefully onto clean parchment, capturing every payment, every meeting in the village, every fragment of information passed to Edmund Grey across the months since his hiring. The picture that emerged was damning beyond anything they had anticipated, revealing not only the scheme to steal the confirmation letter, but evidence of forged correspondence, deliberately falsified estate records, and a pattern of manipulation stretching back nearly 2 years, long before Julian's engagement to Priscilla had ever been formally announced. By the time the confession was complete and signed, dawn had begun creeping pale through the study windows, and Julian sat back in his chair, the weight of everything they had uncovered settling heavy across his tired features. "This is enough," he said quietly, studying the signed pages spread before him. "This is more than enough to expose Edmund Grey publicly, to strip him of whatever standing and credibility he still holds within this county. Whatever claim he believed he could build against this family, it ends here, tonight, in these pages." Alara looked at him across the candlelit study, exhaustion and triumph mingling in equal measure across both their faces. "What happens to Priscilla, once this becomes known? She may be innocent of the deeper scheme, caught up in Edmund's ambitions the same as poor Colm was." "That," Julian said, is a question we shall have to answer very soon, once this confession reaches the ears it needs to reach. But tonight, at least, we have finally turned the tide against a man who believed himself far too clever to ever be caught. Outside the study windows, the first true light of morning spread golden across the Ashworth grounds, and Alara felt, for the first time since her wedding day, something close to hope settling steady in her chest. That hope was tested sooner than she expected. The Dowager, upon learning of the signed confession, insisted the matter be brought before witnesses as publicly and swiftly as possible, before Edmund Gray could learn his scheme had unraveled and flee the county with whatever resources remained to him. A grand supper had already been planned for the following evening, a gathering of the county's most prominent families meant originally to celebrate the new marriage. Constance saw no reason to cancel it now. Instead, she saw an opportunity. "Let him come," she said, her gray eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. "Let him sit at our table believing himself still safe, still clever, still one step ahead of us all, and then let him discover exactly how wrong he has been, in front of every family whose good opinion he has spent years courting." The evening arrived with a tension Alara could feel humming beneath every polite greeting and practiced smile exchanged across the crowded dining hall. Edmund Gray arrived precisely on time, immaculately dressed, Priscilla on his arm, her expression carefully composed, though Alara caught the faint wariness in her eyes as she surveyed the room. Whatever confidence Edmund still carried, Priscilla's own certainty seemed to have thinned considerably in the weeks since the wedding. Alara sat beside Julian at the head of the long table, playing her role as Duchess with a steadiness that surprised even herself, though her heart beat fast beneath her composed exterior throughout the entire first course. She caught Julian's eye once across the table, a silent exchange of shared resolve, and felt steadied by it more than she expected. The moment came after the second course had been cleared, when the Dowager rose from her seat at the table, silencing the room's polite chatter with nothing more than her presence. "Before we continue this pleasant evening," Constance said, her voice carrying clear and commanding across the hall, "I find myself obligated to address a matter of some importance, concerning the honesty and character of one among our guests tonight." A ripple of curious murmurs moved through the gathered families. Edmund's expression flickered, just barely, a crack in his careful composure. "Lord Edmund Gray," the Dowager continued, "has spent the better part of 2 years orchestrating a scheme against this family, involving forged documents, bribed servants, and an attempted theft carried out within these very walls, not 4 nights past." The room fell utterly silent. Every eye turned toward Edmund, whose face had gone pale despite his obvious effort to maintain composure. "These are serious accusations, Your Grace," he said carefully, "made without any proof I have yet seen presented." "Proof," the Dowager said, "which I am happy to provide." Julian rose and produced Colm's signed confession, reading aloud a portion of its damning contents to the hushed and horrified assembly, detailing payments, meetings, and the forged inheritance documents Edmund had commissioned in hopes of challenging the Ashworth title through the courts. Gasps rippled through the room as the full scope of the scheme became clear to guests who had, until moments before, considered Edmund Gray a respectable and welcome member of county society. Priscilla's face drained of all color as she listened, her eyes moving rapidly between Edmund and the confession Julian held, understanding dawning with visible horror across her features. "You told me," she said, her voice rising sharp and furious, "that you loved me, that the marriage to Julian was only ever meant to secure our future together, once his claim to the title proved weak enough to challenge. You never once mentioned forgery, or theft, or bribing servants to steal from a man's own household." "Priscilla," Edmund began, reaching for her arm, but she wrenched away from him, revulsion clear on her face. "I was a fool," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "but I was not a thief, nor a forger, nor a man willing to ruin an entire family for my own gain. Whatever punishment awaits you, Edmund, you will face it alone. I want no further part of your schemes." She turned to the Dowager, her chin lifted despite the tears now bright in her eyes. "I did not know the full extent of what he planned, Your Grace. I believed only that the marriage negotiations had grown complicated, nothing more sinister than ordinary legal disputes over land. I am ashamed to have been so easily deceived, but I swear before every person in this room that I had no knowledge of forgery or theft." The Dowager studied her for a long considering moment before nodding once, sharp and final. "I am inclined to believe you, Lady Priscilla, given how readily you have turned from him the moment the truth came to light. That speaks better of your character than anything else that has occurred this evening." Edmund, seeing his last remaining ally abandon him before the assembled guests, rose from his seat with what dignity he could still muster, though his hands trembled visibly at his sides. "This is a conspiracy," he said, though his voice lacked all conviction now, hollow and desperate in the silent hall. "A scheme cooked up between a scorned mother and a florist's daughter playing at nobility, determined to ruin an honest man's reputation out of spite." "An honest man," Julian said quietly, "does not bribe footmen to steal family documents in the dead of night. I have the confession, Edmund, signed and witnessed. I have the forged records you commissioned. Whatever reputation you believed yourself protecting tonight, I am afraid it is already beyond saving." Two footmen, summoned quietly by the Dowager before the supper had even begun, stepped forward at her signal to escort Edmund from the hall, his protests growing increasingly desperate as he was led away past the horrified stares of guests who had, until that very evening, counted him among their trusted acquaintances. The heavy doors closed behind him, and for a long moment silence reigned over the entire dining hall. Then, slowly, conversation began again, hushed and disbelieving, guests turning to one another to process the astonishing scene they had just witnessed. Alara let out a long, unsteady breath, feeling the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to loosen its grip on her chest. Priscilla approached the head of the table before departing, her composure returning slowly despite the evening's humiliation. "Your Grace," she said quietly to Alara, "I owe you an apology, I think, though I hardly know where to begin offering one. Whatever anger I felt toward you these past weeks, I understand now it was never truly your doing at all. We were both caught in something far larger than ourselves," Alara said gently. "I bear you no ill will, Lady Priscilla. I hope you find your way to a happier future than the one Edmund Grey nearly cost you." Priscilla managed a small, grateful smile before departing, and Alara turned to find Julian watching her with an expression of quiet wonder, as though seeing her fully for the first time. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly, once the hall had mostly emptied and only family remained. "Grace under pressure is not a thing easily taught, Alara. You carried yourself tonight like a woman born to this position, rather than one thrown into it by chance and desperation." "Perhaps," Alara said, "it was never entirely chance at all." Julian's dark eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary, something warm and unspoken passing between them in the quiet aftermath of the evening storm, and Alara felt, watching him, that whatever strange path had led her to this house and this life, she was no longer entirely certain she wished to have walked any other road. A letter arrived at Ashworth Hall 3 weeks after the supper that had ended Edmund Grey's schemes forever, sealed with the Crown's own mark, and Julian's hands were not quite steady as he broke it open in the privacy of his study. Alara watched from across the room, her own pulse quickening with uncertain anticipation. "The magistrate has ruled," Julian said slowly, scanning the dense legal language. "Edmund Grey stands formally charged with forgery, theft, and conspiracy against this family's title and estate. His properties are seized pending trial. His standing among the county's gentry, whatever remained of it after that evening, is finished entirely." "And Colum?" Alara asked. "Granted safe passage from the county, exactly as promised, along with enough coin to begin honestly wherever he chooses to settle." Julian set the letter down, exhaling a long breath that seemed to release weeks of accumulated tension all at once. "It is finished, Alara, truly finished, this time." She crossed the room and settled into the chair across from his desk, studying his face in the quiet aftermath of news they had both waited weeks to hear. "You do not look nearly as relieved as I expected." Julian's mouth curved into a small, rueful smile. "I am relieved, but relief brings its own complications, does it not? For weeks now, our marriage has existed under the shadow of a scheme we needed to survive together. Now that the danger has passed, I find myself wondering what remains between us, once necessity no longer binds us quite so tightly." Alara's breath caught at the honesty in his words, at the vulnerability she rarely saw him allow himself to show. "What do you wish to remain between us, Julian?" He rose from behind the desk and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her chair with an earnestness that stripped away every trace of the composed, distant Duke she had first encountered outside the chapel doors on her wedding morning. "I wish for a great many things," he said quietly. "I wish I had met you under gentler circumstances, without schemes and danger forcing us together, before either of us had the chance to choose freely. I wish I could offer you a courtship, flowers and quiet conversation, and slow, patient discovery, rather than a hurried vow spoken beneath a stranger's veil. But I cannot undo the path that brought us here, Alara. I can only tell you plainly what I have come to feel along the way." "Tell me then," she whispered. "I have come to love you," Julian said, his voice steady despite the raw honesty of the words. Not out of gratitude for what you risked that morning, though I am grateful beyond measure. Not out of duty to a marriage neither of us chose freely at first. I love the way you speak plainly even to a duke who could have your family's livelihood destroyed with a single careless word. I love the courage you showed standing beside me through every danger these past weeks, when you might have fled back to Millbank Lane and left me to face it all alone. I love you, Alara Whitfield, entirely and completely, and I find I no longer wish to think of this marriage as a scheme we survived together, but as the truest, most fortunate accident of my entire life. Tears rose unexpected and warm in Alara's eyes, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling in his voice, feeling matched so completely by something she had been quietly nursing in her own heart for weeks now, without daring to name it aloud. I was so afraid, she admitted finally, that whatever I felt growing between us was only the product of danger and desperation, the kind of closeness forced upon two strangers thrown together by crisis, destined to fade once the crisis itself had passed. But it has not faded, Julian. If anything, it has only grown steadier with every day that passes. Then tell me plainly, Julian said, taking her hands in his. What do you feel, Alara? I love you, she said, the words simple and certain once she finally allowed herself to speak them. I did not expect to. I did not ask to. But I love you, Julian Ashworth, veil and vows and stolen letters and all. Julian rose then, drawing her up from the chair into his arms, and kissed her properly for the first time since that brief, formal touch at the altar. No audience watching, no scheme requiring performance, only the honest truth of two people who had found, against every unlikely odd, something real within a marriage that had begun as nothing more than desperate deception. When at last they parted, Julian rested his forehead against hers, a smile transforming his usually stern features into something entirely unguarded. There is one matter still left unresolved, he said softly. What matter is that? I never properly asked you to marry me, he said, and Alara laughed despite herself, bright and unrestrained. The vicar asked, and you answered him, but I have never once asked you myself, freely, without scheme or danger forcing either of our hands. He stepped back, and to Alara's astonishment, lowered himself onto one knee before her, exactly as any suitor might, exactly as she had never once imagined a duke doing for a florist's daughter. Alara Whitfield, he said, already my wife by law and by signature, will you also be my wife by choice, freely given, with nothing left unresolved between us but the simple, honest truth that I love you, and wish to spend the whole of my life proving it? Yes, Alara said, laughing through fresh tears, though I believe this is rather the wrong order for such a question, Julian. Everything about how we met was the wrong order, he said, rising to pull her close again. I see no reason our proposal should follow convention any more faithfully than the rest of our story has. In the weeks that followed their private confession of love, Julian insisted on a proper courtship despite the marriage already standing legally complete, determined to give Alara every small kindness he felt she had been denied by the strange circumstances of their beginning. He brought her flowers each morning, though she laughed every time, pointing out that she likely knew more about proper flower arrangement than any merchant in the county. He walked with her through the estate gardens in the evenings, asking about her childhood, her father's memory, the small dreams she had once nursed as a girl trimming stems behind her mother's counter, long before any duke or scheme had entered her quiet life. I always imagined, she confessed one evening, as they walked beneath a canopy of old oak trees near the estate's eastern boundary, that I might one day have a small garden of my own, nothing grand, just enough space to grow roses without worrying whether the shop's rent would be paid that month. I never once imagined anything close to this. Julian glanced around at the sprawling grounds surrounding them, acres of cultivated beauty stretching toward the horizon in every direction. Then let us make one corner of this entire estate truly yours, he said. Choose whatever ground you wish, and I will see it planted exactly as you dream it, roses and all, a garden belonging to no one but the Duchess of Ashworth herself. Alara chose a quiet plot near the old chapel, sheltered by a low stone wall, and warmed by afternoon sun, and within a month, the first seedlings had taken root under her careful direction, tended personally each morning, before her other duties claimed her attention. It became, in time, her favorite place in the entire estate, a small piece of her old life woven seamlessly into her new one. Not every moment of those weeks passed without difficulty. At a county assembly held soon after Edmund's arrest became widely known, Alara found herself the subject of pointed whispers from a cluster of older matrons who considered a florist's daughter entirely unsuited to the rank she now carried, whatever heroic tale had accompanied her rise. She overheard one particularly cutting remark near the refreshment table, comparing her unfavorably to the polished young ladies more traditionally suited to a duke's attention. Julian, arriving at her side just as the comment landed, offered his arm with quiet, deliberate warmth, loud enough for the entire cluster of gossiping matrons to hear clearly. "I have found," he said, "that true character reveals itself far more honestly under pressure than any amount of polished breeding ever could. My wife stood steady through danger that would have broken far more traditionally suited ladies entirely. I count myself fortunate beyond measure that she chose to stand beside me at all." The matrons fell into embarrassed silence, and Alara felt a fierce, grateful warmth spread through her chest at his easy, unwavering defense. Such moments repeated themselves in smaller ways throughout those early weeks, and each time Julian met them with the same steady loyalty, until slowly, gradually, the whispers softened into grudging respect, and eventually into genuine admiration, as county society came to know the woman behind the remarkable story for herself. News of their genuine happiness spread through Ashworth Hall faster than any scandal ever could have. The dowager, upon hearing the particulars from her son directly, allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile of satisfaction, though she could not resist reminding them both, with characteristic sharpness, that she had recognized Alara's worth from the very first moment in that courtyard, long before either of them had come to recognize it in each other. "I gambled everything on a florist's daughter with kind eyes," Constance said over supper that evening, raising her glass in a small, private toast. "I confess I did not expect the gamble to pay off quite so thoroughly as this, but I find myself entirely content with the outcome." "You very nearly ruined my life with that gamble," Julian said, though there was no real complaint in his voice, only warm amusement. "I very nearly saved it," his mother corrected, "and gave you the finest wife in the county in the process. I shall accept your gratitude whenever you find yourself ready to offer it properly." Alara's mother visited often in the weeks that followed, watching her daughter settle more fully into her new life with a mixture of pride and quiet disbelief that never quite faded. The shop on Millbank Lane continued to flourish under the secured lease, and Alara made certain to visit whenever her duties at the hall allowed, unwilling to let her new title erase the humble roots that had shaped her into the woman Julian had come to love. A formal announcement of their courtship, framed carefully by the dowager to satisfy society's expectations regarding proper romance before marriage, however inverted the actual order of events had truly been, spread through the county's finest drawing rooms within a fortnight. Whatever whispers had once circulated about the mysterious circumstances of the wedding faded steadily into admiration for a love story that seemed, to outside eyes, almost too romantic to be entirely true. Few beyond the household itself ever learned the full particulars of veils and schemes and desperate bargains that had brought the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth together in the first place. On a warm afternoon some months later, Alara stood once more in the chapel where her false wedding had become, against every expectation, a true and lasting marriage. This time she stood beside Julian not as a stranger thrust into borrowed silk, but as his wife renewing her vows freely before family and friends, who now knew and loved her for exactly who she was. White roses lined the aisle once more, cut that morning by her own hands from the gardens she had helped cultivate across the estate grounds, their sweet fragrance filling the old stone chapel exactly as it had on that first uncertain morning. "Do you take this man?" the vicar asked, the same words spoken months before under such different circumstances. "To have, and to hold, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Alara said, and this time the words carried none of the fear or uncertainty that had trembled beneath them the first time, only steady, joyful certainty, and a love that had grown from the strangest possible beginning into something neither of them would ever wish to unmake. Julian kissed her properly before the entire gathered assembly this time, no careful formality restraining him, and the chapel erupted into genuine, joyful applause, so different from the nervous, uncertain ceremony that had first bound them together. Afterward, standing together on the chapel steps as guests scattered rice and well-wishes across the courtyard where Alara had once stood trembling with a basket of roses, uncertain whether to flee or stay, Julian drew her close against his side. "From flower girl to duchess," he murmured against her hair, "in the strangest single morning this county has ever witnessed. From duty to something far better," Alara answered, tilting her face up to meet his smile with her own. "I would not trade a single moment of it, Julian, not even the frightening parts. Especially not those, perhaps, since they led us here." The dowager watched from the chapel doors with quiet satisfaction, her gray eyes soft for once with something very near to tenderness, as her son and his true, chosen bride walked together down the very steps where a desperate scheme had first begun, now transformed entirely into the foundation of a lasting, genuine love neither of them had ever expected to find. A small celebration followed in the great hall, far warmer and less formal than the tense wedding breakfast that had marked their first ceremony months before. Ilara's mother sat near the head of the table this time, no longer merely a guest arriving by hasty carriage, but a welcomed member of the family in her own right, laughing freely with the dowager over some shared memory of Ilara's childhood stubbornness. The two women, so different in rank and history, had become unlikely friends over the months since the wedding, bonded by their shared devotion to the same remarkable young woman. Even Priscilla sent a brief, gracious letter that arrived the following week, wishing the couple well and confessing that she had found a quiet measure of peace since Edmund's trial concluded, choosing to spend the season away from society's prying eyes at a cousin's estate in the north, where she hoped to rebuild her reputation slowly and honestly. Ilara read the letter aloud to Julian that evening, glad to know the other woman had found some measure of grace amid the wreckage Edmund's schemes had left behind. Merritt, promoted at the dowager's insistence to head lady's maid in recognition of her quiet loyalty during the difficult weeks of investigation, stood near the doorway during the celebration, allowing herself a rare smile as she watched the Duchess she had helped guide through danger now radiant with genuine happiness. Combe, too, sent word eventually, a brief note from a distant county confirming he had found honest work as a groundskeeper on a modest estate, grateful beyond words for the mercy shown him, and determined never again to place himself in a position where desperation might lead him astray. As the evening celebration wound down and guests began departing into the warm summer night, Julian drew Ilara away from the remaining crowd, out through the garden doors toward the small plot of roses she had planted with her own hands months before. The flowers had grown full and fragrant, climbing steadily up the low stone wall, filling the evening air with sweetness that carried her back, for just a moment, to that very first morning she had arrived at these gates with a basket of blooms and no notion at all of the life waiting to unfold before her. "Do you ever think of that morning?" Julian asked quietly, settling beside her on the small stone bench overlooking her garden, "when my mother stopped you in the courtyard and asked the impossible of you?" "Often," Ilara admitted. "I think of how frightened I was, how certain I felt that agreeing to her scheme would only end in ruin for us both. I never once imagined it might instead lead me here, to a life and a love I would not trade for anything in this world." Julian took her hand, tracing his thumb gently over the small calluses that still marked her palm from years spent among thorns and stems, the calluses she had never once tried to hide despite her new rank and station. "My mother always insisted she saw something in you that morning worth gambling everything upon," he said. "I confess I did not fully believe her at the time. I believe her completely now." "And what did she see, do you think?" "Someone honest enough to be trusted with a family's most dangerous secret," Julian said, "and brave enough to carry that trust through every danger that followed, without ever once losing the kindness that made her worth trusting in the first place." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles. "She saw, I think, exactly the woman I have come to love beyond every reasonable measure." Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last golden light of evening fade slowly behind the old chapel spire, the fragrance of her own roses wrapping warm and sweet around them both. Whatever strange, frightening path had first brought her through the gates of Ashworth Hall, she found herself, in this quiet garden moment, grateful beyond words for every uncertain step of the journey that had led her home. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "storms or scandal, or simply the ordinary business of living, I find I am no longer afraid of any of it, so long as we face it together." "Together," Julian echoed, drawing her closer as the first stars began to appear above the darkening estate. "Always together, Ilara. That much, at least, I can promise you with absolute certainty, for as long as we both shall live." A carriage came thundering up the drive at Ashworth Hall 2 years after the vow renewal, far too fast for any ordinary visitor, and Ilara looked up sharply from the rose garden where she knelt trimming stems for the morning's arrangements, her heart lurching with sudden alarm. Julian appeared at the garden gate a moment later, his expression tight with concern. "A messenger from London," he said. "Trouble at the shipping offices tied to the estate's northern investments. Something about falsified accounts discovered in the ledgers, though the details remain unclear until we can review the papers ourselves." Ilara rose quickly, brushing soil from her skirts, old instincts sharpening at once despite the peaceful years that had passed since Edmund Grey's downfall. "Falsified accounts. Julian, that sounds uncomfortably familiar. I thought the same the moment I heard it, he admitted grimly. Come. Let us see exactly what we are dealing with before either of us assumes the worst. They found the messenger waiting in the front hall, a nervous young clerk clutching a leather satchel of documents, sent ahead by the family's man of business in London, with urgent instructions to place the papers directly into the Duke's own hands. Julian led them all into his study, and together he and Alara pored over the ledgers spread across the desk, comparing figures against the estate's known records with the same careful attention that had once uncovered Edmund's schemes years before. Here, Alara said after nearly an hour of careful study, pointing to a column of figures that did not quite align with the shipping manifests filed alongside them. These numbers have been altered, Julian. Someone has been skimming profit from the northern trade routes for at least 18 months, disguising the losses as ordinary maritime expenses. Julian leaned closer, following her finger down the page, his jaw tightening as the pattern became clear. You have a sharper eye for this than half the accountants I employ, he said, something like pride coloring his voice despite the seriousness of the discovery. Whoever has done this knew precisely how to hide their work from anyone who was not looking closely enough to notice. Fortunately, Alara said, allowing herself a small, wry smile, I have had considerable practice looking closely at things others hoped I would overlook. Within the week, the culprit was identified through careful cross-referencing of shipping schedules and warehouse logs, a junior clerk at the London offices who had grown greedy managing accounts far larger than his modest salary, quietly diverting small sums over many months, in hopes the losses would never be noticed among such vast sums of legitimate trade. Unlike Edmund Gray's calculated malice, this proved a simpler matter of ordinary greed, resolved quietly through dismissal and restitution, rather than public scandal, though Julian made certain new safeguards were established across all the estate's business dealings to prevent any similar temptation from taking root again. It seems, Julian said one evening, once the matter had been fully settled and the northern accounts restored to proper order, that marrying a florist's daughter with a talent for uncovering hidden schemes has proven rather more useful to this family's fortunes than I ever could have anticipated on our wedding day. I did warn you, Alara said, settling beside him on the drawing-room settee with the ease of long familiarity, that I learned to watch closely for cheats and schemes long before I ever set foot in this house. A letter arrived not long after the northern accounts matter had been fully resolved, bearing a seal Alara did not immediately recognize, though the elegant handwriting across the front struck her as oddly familiar. She opened it in the drawing room, Julian reading over her shoulder, and found it signed by Priscilla, now Lady Priscilla Fairweather, having married a quiet, kind gentleman from Kent the previous autumn. The letter spoke warmly of a genuine, settled happiness Priscilla had never known during her entangled dealings with Edmund Gray, and included an invitation, tentative and hopeful, for Julian and Alara to visit Kent that summer should their travels ever bring them near. Alara felt a quiet gladness reading it, glad to know the other woman had found her own steady path forward after such a difficult beginning. Shall we accept? Julian asked, watching Alara's face carefully as she finished reading. I think we should, Alara said. It seems fitting, does it not, that both of us found our way to genuine happiness eventually, however different the roads that led us there. They traveled to Kent that summer, and found Priscilla settled comfortably into a modest but happy household, her husband a gentle, unassuming man who clearly adored her, without any of the calculation Edmund had once wrapped around his own affections. The visit passed pleasantly. Old tensions long since faded into easy, cautious friendship, and Alara left Kent with a lightness in her heart she had not expected, grateful to see every thread of that difficult beginning finally settled into something peaceful for everyone involved. Edmund Gray himself, they learned through occasional mentions in London correspondence, had been sentenced to transportation following his trial, his once considerable standing in society utterly and permanently destroyed. Neither Julian nor Alara spoke of him often in the years that followed, content to let that chapter of their story remain firmly closed, its lessons absorbed but its shadow no longer allowed to darken the life they had built together since. Their life together in the years since the vow renewal had settled into a rhythm neither of them had dared hope for during those first frightening weeks of scheme and danger. Alara's small rose garden near the old chapel had grown into something far grander, expanded gradually until it rivaled the estate's formal gardens in beauty, drawing admiring visitors from across the county, eager to see the famous roses tended personally by the Duchess herself. She had also, with Julian's full encouragement, established a small trust to support young women in the county who found themselves, as she once had, caught between duty and desperate circumstance, offering practical assistance and quiet guidance to those navigating hardships she remembered all too well from her own girlhood. Her mother had grown steadily more comfortable dividing her time between the shop on Millbank Lane and lengthy visits to Ashworth Hall, delighting especially in the arrival of her first grandchild the previous spring, a dark-haired daughter named Rose, in quiet tribute to the flowers that had first brought her parents together in such unlikely circumstance. The dowager, far softer now in her advancing years than the sharp, calculating woman who had once cornered a frightened florist's daughter in a courtyard, doted openly on her granddaughter, spoiling her shamelessly whenever Ilara's back was turned, though she would never fully admit to such indulgence when questioned directly. "You have made this family better than I ever managed alone," Constance told Ilara one quiet afternoon, watching young Rose toddle unsteadily across the drawing-room floor, chasing after a scattering of fallen rose petals with delighted determination. "I gambled everything on you that morning, not truly certain whether I was saving my son or condemning us all to further ruin. I find myself endlessly grateful the gamble paid off so thoroughly. You gave me the chance to prove I was more than a frightened girl carrying a basket of flowers," Ilara answered. "I think we saved each other, Your Grace, in ways neither of us fully understood at the time." Word had spread widely, in the years since, of the remarkable story behind the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth's unconventional beginning, softened and romanticized by county gossip into a tale of fated love overcoming schemes and danger, rather than the desperate, uncertain bargain it had truly begun as. Ilara found she no longer minded the retelling, however embellished it had become in the passing years, for whatever the true, complicated beginning had been, the ending had settled into something entirely genuine and lasting. On a warm evening in early summer, Julian found Ilara once more in her rose garden, little Rose asleep against her shoulder after a long afternoon spent among the blooms, the last golden light of day catching softly against both their faces. He settled beside them on the familiar stone bench, watching his small family with an expression of quiet, contented wonder that had never quite faded since the day he first knelt before Ilara in his study and asked her, properly this time, to be his wife. "Do you remember," he asked softly, mindful of the sleeping child between them, "standing at these very gates with a basket of roses, terrified of what my mother was asking of you?" "I remember every moment of it," Ilara said, smiling down at their daughter's peaceful face. "I remember thinking my whole world was about to fall apart, that agreeing to your mother's scheme would surely end in ruin rather than anything close to happiness. And now?" Ilara looked up at him, at the man who had once stood cold and resigned before a marriage neither of them had chosen, now transformed entirely by years of genuine love into someone she could not imagine her life without. "Now," she said softly, "I think that frightened girl in the courtyard could never have imagined how far a single act of courage might carry her, nor how completely it might change the whole shape of her life for the better." Julian leaned close and kissed her gently, careful not to wake their sleeping daughter, and together they sat in comfortable silence as evening settled soft and golden across the gardens Ilara had built with her own two hands, roses blooming steady and fragrant all around them, a living reminder of exactly how far they both had come since that first uncertain morning, and how completely a chance beginning had grown, over time, into something entirely, permanently true. Later that night, once Rose had been carried up to her nursery and settled softly into sleep, Ilara stood a while longer at her bedroom window, looking out over the moonlit gardens below. She thought of her mother, still humming contentedly over the counter on Millbank Lane most mornings, refusing every offer to retire fully from the shop she loved. She thought of Merritt, now trusted above all others in the household, and of Colm, whose brief note the previous winter had mentioned a small cottage and an honest trade finally taking root far from the temptations that had once nearly ruined him. She thought of Priscilla, settled and content in Kent, and even, briefly, of Edmund Grey, whose ambition had cost him everything he once valued. Julian's arms came around her from behind, drawing her back gently against his chest, and she let herself lean into his familiar warmth, watching the last candlelight flicker soft across the darkened gardens. "What are you thinking of, so quietly, at this hour?" he asked. "Everyone whose lives crossed ours along the way," she said. "How strange it is that a single morning, one basket of flowers and one desperate request could ripple outward so widely, touching so many lives beyond our own." "Strange," Julian agreed softly, "and rather wonderful, when I consider it properly. I do not think either of us could have imagined, standing at that altar as strangers, exactly how far that single choice would carry us." "No," Ilara said, turning in his arms to face him fully, the moonlight soft across both their faces. But I would not trade a single moment of the journey, Julian. Not the fear, not the danger, not even the uncertainty of those very first days. Every part of it led us here, to this life, to Rose, to everything we have built together since. Then let us keep building, Julian murmured, resting his forehead gently against hers, for as many years as we are given, and be grateful, always, for the flowers that brought us together in the first place. Outside their window, the roses Ilara had planted with her own hands continued their quiet, steady bloom beneath the summer moon, exactly as they always had since that very first season, a lasting testament to a love that had begun in deception and desperation, and grown, slowly and surely, into something entirely, unshakably real.